今日は時間を取っていただいてありがとうございます。まずそれでは生い立ちなどをお聞かせください。
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to the Japanese guitar playing community. I grew up in East Tennessee, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and my dad was a custom woodworker, a furniture and cabinet maker. So I grew up around the woodworking trade, and I'm also of an age that I grew up in the '60s, with the Beatles and everything that was going on in the '60s. So everybody played in a band, and I played in a band, and I ended up being the guy in the band that was always repairing everybody else's stuff, since I had this kind of mechanical background from growing up with my dad.
その後なぜギタービルダーになられたんでしょうか。それは何が一体きっかけだったんでしょうか。
Well, like I say, I grew up taking everybody's guitar apart, and then in the early '70s I moved to Atlanta to play in a band, Atlanta, Georgia, and worked in a guitar repair shop. I worked for a guy named J. Ryan, who was a local guitar repair person, very skilled, a graduate of the Bavarian Instrument Maker School, so he had a classical training in instrument manufacturing, and so that was really the job at the shop was my day gig, and then I played in a band in the evenings, and from there it just continued to grow. I ended up in California playing guitar in the mid to late '70s, and eventually ended up buying a little repair shop called Charvel Guitar Repair, and that became Charvel Guitars and later Jackson Guitars.
どうしてカリフォルニアにその時移られたんでしょうか。そこで一体何が流行してたんでしょうか。
Well, certainly California was a place that I'd always wanted to come. I came primarily, yes, to play music. I was a guitar player and considered myself a guitar player, and came to California to seek my fame and fortune.
あなたの初期のギタービルダーとしての経験などをお聞かせください。
Well, that's a little bit interesting, maybe. I had been in California for a couple of years as a guitar player, and not become Elvis. I had not become rich and famous, and this opportunity came up to buy this little repair shop, Charvel Guitar Repair, and that was an era when both Fender and Gibson were at a particular low spot. So I had this little repair shop, which is a very long story and much too detailed to go into at this point, but what we found was that guitar players would go buy a Les Paul or a Stratocaster, and they would bring it to us, and they would say, well, I've got this beautiful brand new guitar, but the frets are too small, and the fingerboard's too round, and the tuners don't work very well, and I don't like the sound of the pickups. So we would end up sort of rebuilding this brand new instrument with a flatter fingerboard and bigger frets and better tuners and better pickups. And at one point I decided, well, why not just make the guitar right to start with? And so, utilizing my history of woodworking from my dad, we began making Charvel guitars, and then a little bit later I ran into Randy Rhoads and the Jackson guitar was born.
シャーベルギターを買われたのはいつ頃だったんでしょうか。その頃のシャーベルギターっていうのはどういうものだったんでしょうか。
Charvel Guitar was a repair shop, as I've said, and there were a couple of Charvels that had been put together basically out of Fender parts. I bought the guitar repair shop, Charvel Guitar Repair, on November 10, 1978. And we were primarily a repair shop, but we decided to start building guitars very soon after that.
多くの LA メタルギタリストのためにギターを作られていますけれども、なぜそうなったんでしょうか。またどういう人たちがその時にいたんでしょうか。
To answer that question, I think you have to kind of understand what the scene was like at that particular point. The heavy metal revolution had just really begun. Van Halen, Quiet Riot, a number of bands. There was a very vibrant local scene, and I think you have to try to understand the scene that was alive right then at that particular time. Van Halen was still a local band playing backyard parties, and Quiet Riot was playing local clubs, and there were George Lynch had a band well before Dokken called The Boys. So there was a lot of musicians, and it was a very active scene right then, and we just happened to be very lucky to be at that place at that time.
あなたはその頃に、高崎明、日本のギタリスト高崎明に会ったことありますか？
Well, certainly I was aware of Loudness. This is a little bit later, more towards the mid 80s. I started in the late 70s, and the scene sort of started in LA and then expanded globally. But there was in the mid 80s, I started going to Japan, and in fact spent between 1985 and 1990 about a year, a little more than a year of my life in Japan, mainly in Matsumoto. So I was aware of the Japanese scene, and although I have still never met Akira, I was a big fan of the band. There was a bunch of bands that I liked from that era. I remember going down to the Imperial Palace. There's a park right by the Imperial Palace, and there was a Sunday, and my wife and I went down there, and I saw a band that was then called Flatbacker, which later became EZO, and I was a big fan of that band too. But it was a great scene, and there were great musicians and great music coming out of there, and certainly, Loudness was the top drawer, the top band of that era.
ランディ・ローズもそのうちの一人だったわけですけど、彼の印象はどんなものだったんでしょうか？
Randy and I met, it's a little bit of a longer story. Randy had been, I knew of Randy, although I didn't know him, from playing in Quiet Riot, and Quiet Riot had been around the LA scene for a while and hadn't gotten signed, and it didn't look good for them at that particular point. And Ozzy had come out of Black Sabbath and I think it's pretty well documented, was not in great shape, and Sharon kind of pulled him up by his shirt tails and said, okay, we're going to start up again, and they needed a guitar player. She was going to transition him from being the ex-Black Sabbath singer to being Ozzy that we know today. And so they held auditions, and Randy got the gig, and they went off to England. They recorded Blizzard and released it in Europe, and it was doing pretty well, but it was not released here. Randy came home for Christmas to see his family and called up and said, hey, I need to get a guitar made. Well, this was, I think he called on the 22nd of December, and I'd already turned all the staff loose for Christmas, and I said, okay, well, why don't you come out about noon tomorrow and we'll sit down and talk about it. So it's an empty factory, and it's just me and him. And as it happens, we sat and talked from noon until midnight. It was sort of a 12-hour marathon brofest. And the Randy Rhoads guitar was designed basically that day. He came in with a little sketch, and then from there we, had a long conversation about, these pickups, and the neck shape should be that, and I said, how about the head? And he said, yeah, that sounds great. And the story is that this is so early on in the history of Jackson Charvel that we were making Charvels, but there were no Jackson guitars, and I was concerned because our success at that point was so tenuous, so minute, that this weird shaped guitar might have a negative impact on the little bit of success I had with bolt-on Strat shaped guitars. So I said, hey, what if we put a different name on this? And he said, oh, that's fine, what do you think? And I said, well, Jackson. He says, that's great. So that guitar, that day, the Jackson guitar brand was born, and that's the day that the Randy Rhoads guitar was born. It took several months to make it. And in that period of time, Randy had gone back to the UK because they were going to do a European tour, if I remember right. And we actually shipped the guitar to the Ridge Farm Studios for him to pick up. And then he came back later and said that people thought the original guitar was a modified Gibson Flying V. So he wanted to take the design and continue to have it evolve. And that's where the black guitar came from that he received just 2.5 months before he passed away.
ギターのどの部分を重要視されているでしょうか。シェイプとかカラーとかサウンドですね。
I think you have to take guitar design sort of in its totality. I mean, I've always felt like the instrument, my description of the work that I've done over the years really is not guitars, not music. I try to make tools for guys that have a job to do. And the job happens to be that they either record albums or they go on the road and they play live. But there has to be a utilitarian nature to the instrument. And there is something very strange about the guitar, and it may be the same about running shoes or motorcycles or race cars or whatever, but when you pick up a guitar you get an impression, a feeling of what the instrument is. And that happens actually, I think, before you ever play a single note. There's something about the shape of the neck and the balance of the instrument and the weight of the instrument and just the general feeling of the instrument. So you're sort of getting all of these impressions before you ever play a single note. And the job on my part is to try to make that first impression as good as possible. So really, guitar players, I think, primarily only have instruments for two reasons. To get on stage and impress girls, or get on stage and make a musical statement. So for an instrument to really be correct and work properly, it needs to be invisible. The instrument, you don't get on stage to impress the girls and then start fiddling with the guitar. That doesn't work. The guitar has to go away so that you can impress the girls or make the musical statement. There's the great little segment where the Yardbirds are playing in the 60s, I guess, movie Blow Up. And the guitar, Jeff Beck's guitar starts to make a noise. And he goes back and kicks the amp, and then it starts to make a noise, and he goes back and kicks it again, and finally smashes the guitar. I think that maybe is the source of where I started to think in those terms that the guitar needs to be invisible. And if you're a guy like Jeff Beck and the guitar misbehaves, it has to pay.
会社はその後グローバー・ジャクソンとなって大きくなっていきますけれども、その途中であなたが辞めることになりましたが、何があったんでしょうか。
That's again sort of an interesting story. In 1985, I was pretty much the king of the hill. I mean, at that point, even Gibson and Fender had started to copy some of the things that we were doing, and I had this huge backlog. But the truth was that while I was extremely product savvy, I was not very savvy about money. And so we had these rock stars in every day and magazine articles, and we'd grown the business beyond my ability to financially manage it. So I merged with a company in Fort Worth, Texas, who were the Akai distributor, and that company was International Music Corporation. And the problem then was that I was not the master of my own ship. I had senior partners, and there were some decisions made between 1985 and 1990 that I didn't agree with in terms of the quality of the instruments and the production of the instruments, distribution of the instruments, what the instruments were, because some of the design things got taken out of my hands. And finally, in a fit of frustration in 1990, I was told by my senior partner to go home to California from Texas and fire 85% of the staff and begin to take all the instruments offshore. And I just didn't want to do that, so I said I quit. I basically walked away from my business. And I had a non-compete contract, so I had to stay out of the guitar business for a few years, and I went into the recording studio business and had a studio in Motown's Hitsville Studios in West Hollywood, and I worked in film and TV primarily. I had thought that I would do music projects, with people that I knew from the 80s. Unbeknownst to anybody, 1990 was the year that MTV sort of cut the water off for metal, and the whole music scene changed. So by 91, people that I had expected to do production projects with or recording with or whatever, they were all unemployed. And it was a terrible time, because the 80s had been this huge scene, and then in 1990 it basically stopped, like it hit a brick wall. So.
ジャクソンシャーベルという会社がまだあるのに、なぜ GJ2 を再び立ち上げたんでしょうか。
After in 1993, when my non-compete ran out with my old company, I decided I needed to get a job. So I moved to Chicago, and I ran the Washburn Company for 3 years. But we really hated Chicago because it was darn cold. And in 94, my first daughter was born. We came back in 96 to California, and I ran the Rickenbacker Company for 3 years. And just decided in that period of time, my second daughter was born. And then by 1999, I decided I really just didn't want to work for anybody. I was going to do something, and I wasn't quite sure what. But another cataclysmic event happened, which was that I went through a divorce and ended up a full-time single dad to 2 young girls. So at that point, I really couldn't start my own company. I couldn't work for anybody. I couldn't start a guitar company because of the demands of travel and so on and so forth. So, and I was being Mr. Mom a good part of the day, breakfast, homework, taking girls to school and picking them up, and all the stuff that's involved in parenting young kids. So what I did do was I started a little company doing job shop work, and I did work for Rickenbacker and Fender and G&L and James Trussard and a whole bunch of people. I also made motorcycle parts. I also made some medical parts. Worked in a lot of different things, making stuff, which is my core proficiency. Now, the girls are in their late teens, which has allowed me some freedom. And I ran into my partner John Gold at a NAMM show, and he had just left Fender. He had a very senior position at Fender. And we said, well, what are you doing? No, what are you doing? Well, what are you doing? And through that dialogue, we decided that maybe with his sales experience and capacities and my manufacturing skills and capacities, that maybe there was the elements for a new guitar company. And such was born GJ2 Guitars.
これからの GJ2 の目標は何でしょうか。
World domination.
今日はどうもありがとうございました。最後に日本のファンたちに向けてのメッセージをお願いしたいんです。またキラーギター高崎明にもメッセージをお願いします。
Well, I would say to Japanese guitar fans that they should definitely look into GJ2, because this is the natural culmination of my entire life's work. I don't think I've ever made better guitars in my entire life. And to Akira, I would say I'm very happy to hear that you're playing and continue on your great legacy as Japan's premier metal guitarist. Rock on, dude.